ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Nick Kaldas migrated to Australia as a kid with his family. They were from Egypt and they were looking to escape persecution. Life was hard to begin with, but when Nick grew up, he fulfilled his parents' fondest dream and he took up a career as a police officer. Well, actually, his parents really wanted him to become a doctor, but he thrived in the police force anyway. Nick started on the beat, then as one of the few detectives who spoke Arabic, he worked undercover for years. And he tracked down one of Australia's most notorious armed robbers who had exposed himself when he tried to get a hair transplant. Nick played a leading role in some of New South Wales' biggest criminal investigations before being tapped to go to post-invasion Iraq to help rebuild its police force after Saddam Hussein. Nick Kaldas has written a memoir and it's called Behind the Badge, which is subtitled with his motto, "Do good work, live by your beliefs, fear no one." Hello, Nick.
Thanks very much for having me, Richard. I just want to clarify one thing.
Yes.
It was the crook that sought the hair transplant, not me. I thought there may have been some confusion there.
I think that's important we get that nailed down at a very early stage here. You've still got a fine head of hair, sir. Which is a marvellous thing. Tell me about some of your memories of being a small boy growing up in the south of Egypt.
Yeah, very fond memories, Richard. We were quite well off, but it was just Asyut, the city that I grew up in. All of my family were there. My father was one of 11. My mother was one of 6. So I had a million cousins to grow up with and to hang out with and so on.
What do you remember of the family home being like?
It was quite nice. There's 4 apartments in one building. My grandfather, Naguib Kaldas Senior, I was named after him. He was a Bey, which is the equivalent of Sir, and then Basha's the equivalent of Lord. He was knighted by King Farouk, who he'd met and knew. And we had 2 other families. I think my father's auntie and her 2 daughters lived downstairs, and we were upstairs. And my grandmother, Eveline Kaldas, was there. And she used to be accused of favouring me because I was the only grandson that was named after her husband, Naguib. Naguib's my real name, my full name. Nick's just a nickname that I got at school.
What was your dad's business that made him so well-to-do?
Land is really the way people keep their wealth in Upper Egypt. And he had a significant amount of holdings himself, which was farmed by staff, if you like. So they were farming cucumbers, tomatoes, chamomile was very big, and they were exporting all of those to Europe. And my father had contacts at the other end, and he used to travel to Milan and Paris and London sometimes, where they would export the produce to on a very large scale.
So your family were part of the Coptic Christian community there, which has lived in Egypt since the days of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
How did that work at that time? Were you well integrated with the Muslim majority, or did you kind of live with your own community?
No, I think there isn't an area you'd say that this is where the Christians live. We're very much all mixed in. I think the official version is that the Coptic Orthodox and Christians generally are around 10%, maybe 15% of the population. There's a sense in the community that's probably larger, but for political reasons it's sort of dumbed down. But certainly it was a lovely period in my life, and I look back on it very fondly. Quite a happy time. In
the 50s, there was a lot of political turmoil in Egypt. King Farouk was overthrown in a military coup led by Colonel Nasser and a bunch of other colonels. What did that mean for your family after the Nasser coup?
I wasn't born in 52 when he was overthrown, or 53, but my sort of family memory is that they actually thought it wasn't going to be a bad thing, and it wasn't for quite some years. But a few things happened. We used to have an immigration department in Egypt, and a lot of Greeks and Italians and Maltese around the Mediterranean used to migrate to Egypt because it was the land of milk and honey. That definitely changed. Nasser's regime adopted a slogan, Egypt for the Egyptians, and they seized a lot of their assets and forced them out of the country, which obviously later on people realised wasn't a good thing at all. And then eventually with the politics of the time and the Cold War that was going on, Nasser very much fell into the Soviet camp, the Eastern Bloc, rather than the West. And you could argue forever about whether that was right or wrong, but it certainly had an impact on the ground.
Yeah, so he nationalised the farms, didn't he?
He nationalised and you got scrip bonds of some sort, government bonds, which a lot of people thought was just worthless, and I think they turned out to be that way. But certainly a lot of our family wealth was wiped out in two lots when they nationalised. They said you can have 500,000 acres per head in the family, and then they said you can have only 200, and everything else you forfeited. You never actually got paid for it. It was supposed to be distributed to the peasants, but we're not really sure what happened to it.
NASA had a secret police. Did they target your father?
I don't know that my father ever put it that way, but most Middle Eastern countries, if there is a non-democratic government, dictated up to and including dictators, have to have a secret police to enforce their views and to make sure there's no dissidents and so on. And Egypt definitely had a mukhabarat, secret police. And my dad felt that at some point, because he had stood up to on many issues that the government had attacked him about, he felt he was definitely a target.
So on the one hand, they were sort of directed at the Muslim Brotherhood, the radical Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt at the time, but also against any kind of former business people who would have stood up to them.
Yeah, current business people. So they had committee hearings where they would ask them in Arabic, "Min ayna laka haza?" Like, why should you be rich, basically? And my father, as I mentioned earlier, Richard, was one of 11. He didn't inherit anything. He had done well, but he had worked very hard for everything he had. My dad was a weightlifter. Until the day he died, he sort of had massive big biceps, and he didn't take any crap from anyone. He was very fair, but he had obviously resented, really struggling under the yoke of the government at the time. Things have changed, obviously, tremendously since then, but certainly at the time, he felt the weight of the government seizing assets, watching anyone who had been rich and so on. And he didn't feel there was a future for us anymore, either for us as kids or for him.
So that's when he and your mum began to plot their escape?
Yeah.
The Six-Day War broke out in 1967. This is when Egypt and Syria and Jordan decided to work together, act in concert to plan an attack on Israel. Israel saw this was coming, acted preemptively, and the war was an absolute disaster for Nasser.
It was a disaster for the Arabs generally.
Yes.
And anyone who spent time in the Middle East would know Arabs love a good conspiracy, love a conspiracy. So the theory at the time, and I've got cousins that will debate with you all day that it's true, is that the Russians deliberately held up the Arabs, said to them not to attack first, no element of surprise, and may have even helped Israel with locations of aeroplanes being stored and so on. So it was a hammering. They hit the Air Force first, so the Arab forces had no air cover, and the rest is history, obviously.
And was that kind of like the last straw for your dad?
I think the economy certainly took a hit. The national mood was completely shattered, and I think a lot of people could not see a light at the end of the tunnel. Things were definitely heading in the wrong direction. Staying in a Soviet camp was something that was, people just recognised that it was a bad place to be. We expected there would be other wars, and there were after we left, and he just basically said, this isn't going to work out. You won't have a future here. I've got to get you somewhere where you'll have a bright future.
What do you remember then about leaving Egypt? You said you were growing up in this apartment block with all the family around you, millions of cousins to play with, leaving all that behind. That must have been hard, Nick.
It was actually. It was quite hard. I mean, I look back on it now, and the hardest part probably is not knowing what we were going to. We didn't really know anyone in Australia. We didn't know anything about Australia. And
it's really common when I talk to people who migrated to Australia as a kid. You say, what were you imagining Australia would be like? And they say, a dusty landing aeroplane strip and kangaroos everywhere outside. Was it like that for you?
No, it actually did look a bit like that when we got here. The airport in 1969 was woeful. But no, I think in my own mind I sort of envisaged what Dubai is today. I thought it would be something like that. Which it wasn't, obviously, but we didn't really know what to expect.
What were the scenes like at the airport, though, with the aunties and cousins?
When we were leaving, yeah, it was hard. It was really hard, and I think I mentioned in the book my auntie Betty, who's one of my favourite aunts and quite a character. She had an incredible wit, but she grabbed me very firmly and said to me, every night before you go to bed, in between crying bouts, every night before you go to bed, I want you to say, Auntie Betty, Auntie Betty, Auntie Betty, so you'll never forget me. Yeah.
So you arrive in Sydney, and what was your impression? It doesn't sound like it was too crash hot arriving in Sydney in the late 1960s.
So it was June or July, and so it was winter, the middle of winter, and we'd left the Middle East summer. So that was one problem. There was some problem with foot and mouth disease, and we had been warned that we had to buy brand new shoes and keep them in their box with a receipt. and change them once we got here because they took all our shoes off us. Everyone had to get their shoes out of their bags and hand them in.
So you're cold and you're in uncomfortable shoes.
It gets worse.
Right. Okay.
When we land, someone with 2 aerosol cans went up and down the aisle spraying us like we were cows. And a lot of the Arabs really objected to that. What are you doing? And then we met an unethical hire car driver who said he had spent time in Egypt. He was of Italian origin, and took us to his cousin who had a real estate agency, who said to my father, whatever money you've got to give it all to us now. This is what everyone has to do when you get here. You'll have to buy a house straight away.
And did your father consent to that?
No, not at all. He was never going to do it. We were waiting in the car, and then he came out and he could cut the air with a knife, and my dad almost throttled this guy. And I think to get even with us, he took us to the People's Palace, which is a hotel for the homeless run by the Salvation Army in Pitt Street, near Central. I think it's flash apartments now, very expensive apartments. But I think it was him being cranky with us. So he said, this is the sort of hotel you have to stay in. So we checked in, and we realised within a very short time that we stayed for about 3 nights, I think, all up. We knew of one family in Sydney that may have been able to help us, and there was an old friend of my uncle, Heshmat Sharata, who I think has passed away now. He migrated to America from Australia, but he lived in Randwick, so we found our way to Randwick. I think we got in on a Friday or something, and we went on a Saturday, and we went on a Sunday, and slipped notes under the door saying, it's us, we're in Sydney, can we please...
We're trapped in the People's Palace.
We're trapped in the People's Palace. We didn't know any different. My mother and my sister thought, if this is Australia, this is terrible, we've got to go home, and you've got to throw yourself on the mercy of the regime.
Well, yeah, I know, and it's got slightly Soviet overtones too. We're staying in the People's Palace, that's not good, is it?
No.
So you keep leaving notes for this friend of the family?
And they didn't, and then finally on the 3rd day, apparently it was a long weekend, and he'd taken the family away. Once he got the notes, he immediately came to the hotel and said, what the hell are you doing here? This is for homeless people. You can't be here. And we thought, thank God for that. We thought this was the norm. But and then it was sort of a compulsory few years in Marrickville. That's where most migrants went in those days.
Well, Marrickville's great, and it's lively and all that, but it must have been quite, I suppose, a come down for a family that was used to living in quite an affluent manner. I'm imagining you had servants probably in
We
Egypt.
did, yeah. We had quite a few. There was 2 maids and a cook and a driver, but we all look back on Marrickville very fondly. We had a really good time there. I went to Marrickville de la Salle, the nearest school. My brother was 4 at the time. He didn't start school straight away. But ultimately, when he began school, he didn't speak much English. And I spoke English, French and Arabic when I got here because I had been to a school in Egypt. I'm not unusual. That's what most people in Egypt would, in those days, have at least a couple of languages from school. But he was really worried about not being able to speak English fluently. But he's fine. I mean, it didn't hold him back. But we didn't have any furniture, obviously. We rented an unfurnished apartment, and I'll always remember my father bought a car, and we went to what was then Grace Brothers on Broadway, and I remember him buying 5 mattresses, 10 blankets, and 5 pillows, and we literally just slept on the floor for a little while until we got our act together, got beds and everything else.
And how old were you at this point?
12, and then I turned 13, yeah.
So your dad had been quite a respectable businessman. How did he find himself some work once he was in Australia?
He got a job on the factory floor at Standard Telephones and Cables in Redfern, just doing manual labour. He would have done anything when we got here, and he did. And I think it was a come down for him in many ways, but mainly because he'd never worked for anyone else or taken orders before. He was always the guy who owns the business and so on. And he did a few things. He had a courier van for a little while after that, but he always wanted to set up something where he could run it and be judged on his outcomes and results, obviously. So eventually we rented a place at Flemington. We painted it. I helped, obviously. The 2 of us painted it and tiled it, and bought, I think, 6 washing machines and 6 dryers and some other equipment, and we set up a laundry and dry cleaning place, which he ran until he passed away.
So, like you say, you were born with the name Naguib, but you call yourself Nick. How did you get the nickname Nick? Nick?
There's a fellow that went to school with me at Greystanes High School, and I regret I can't remember his surname, but his first name was Lance. And he said to me, you're going to have a hell of a time with people trying to say Naguib, and there's a silent U in there, which so people muck it up and they say Naguib and all sorts of things. He said, let's just call you Nick. It'll be a lot easier. And then that's what happened. Others around him said, no, that's good. That'll do. I got stuck.
As you grew older, your sister came home one day and told your parents that she'd fallen in love with an Aussie bloke, not just an Aussie bloke, but an Aussie bloke called Bruce. Bruce, how did that go over with the family?
My mum was sort of neutral, but my dad basically said, no, it's not happening. And I just need to put it in context, if I may. My dad had worked on the factory floor, and he worked with quite a few nationalities, and certainly a lot of Aussie guys who used to come in after payday, say, I got drunk last night, I got rid of my paycheck over at the bar or in the poker machines, I went home and beat my wife up. He formed a view at that stage that Aussies generally, that's what Aussies were. He didn't recognise, it was very difficult for him to realise that he was in a lower socioeconomic area where perhaps mixed in with some of the ethnic groups. That's not Australia. That wasn't, even then I don't think it was Australia. So he just said, no, it's not happening. You're not going to marry an Aussie, and I don't want you to have anything to do with him. And that went on for a bit, I think it was probably 18 months or so. And the equation changed when my mother changed sides. She was formidable. And once she changed sides, he had to bend.
How did it work out in the end with Bruce?
But they're fine. He came over on a Saturday morning, and my father said, well, you're not doing anything with him unless I meet him. So he came over on a Saturday morning, and he had a nice suit on and a haircut and parked out the front neatly and came in and very respectful. And then for a couple of hours, we had a cup of tea and a chat. My brother and I were peeking through the window as he was walking in. What's he look like? What's he look like? And then eventually it went well. And then my father said, well, I'm going to have to meet your parents. And so the next weekend, he and his mum and dad came in suits and very nice. And then my dad realised they were actually very decent people. They're quite, fairly religious and just really upstanding citizens. They've been married for, 50 years now. And they are the happiest people you could possibly think of. They had 3 wonderful kids, all of whom have married and moved on. He's been an incredibly positive influence in our family.
What made you want to enter the police force? And, you should not be embarrassed. And if it's ambition, that's one thing. But was there some kind of secret burning love of justice or a place where you could offer your talents? What was it, Nick, in all honesty? What's the passion there?
It certainly was not ambition. And in my mind, I thought I would remain where the rubber meets the road at the operational level forever. I've always wanted to be. I've played with guns and cops and robbers and all that when I was a kid. And I think I mentioned in the book, I make a confession that I'm a big fan of Batman, who was a detective, and he's the only superhero who doesn't have any superpowers, so any of us could be Batman.
His superpower is his brain.
Yeah, well,
his detective abilities, yes.
He's asked in one of the movies that Ben Affleck plays Batman in, and they said, the Flash asks him, I'm sorry, this is for the DC and Marvel nerds, the Flash asks him, what's your superpower? And he says to him, I'm rich. That's all he says. Anyway, so I've always wanted to do it, but for some time I sort of resisted the urge because I actually didn't think I was tall enough. There were height requirements back then. When I did go in finally, I plucked up the courage and went into College Street headquarters, and I was fine for height. I was borderline underweight, which I find my wife finds impossible to believe these days, the ravages of time. But it was always what I wanted to do, and not only that, but I knew when I went into cops that I would want to be a detective. I wasn't going to stay in uniform. And there's absolutely no slight on general duties. You have to do minimum of 3 years. I did about 3.5 years, and then gravitated towards criminal investigation.
So seriously, it was about being a detective then. It was the intellectual challenge of that and getting a good result at the end of it.
I used to say this to graduating detective classes. It's about righting wrongs. It's about helping those who can't help themselves. I have a dear friend called Mike Julian, who's a deputy commissioner in the NYPD, and he's far more philosophical and smarter than I am. But he sort of analysed himself, and he'd been bullied as a kid. And he felt that a lot of us joined the police because at some point we had witnessed or been a victim of bullying, and that we seek to right the wrongs by being in an organisation and a profession where you spend all day, every day, righting wrongs. I was really happy working in an office in an insurance company, and the social life was tremendous, and the people are great, and some of us, friends for life. They're still very dear friends. But I just looked ahead in 5, 10, 20 years' time, and I couldn't see myself doing that forever. The money was good, obviously, and all that, but I knew I needed to do this. And if I had only lasted a couple of years and failed at it, then so be it. I wouldn't have regretted never having given it a go.
Like I said, your mum was aghast. She wanted you to be a doctor. That must have been, in all honesty, quite a formidable challenge to confront, given your mum's power within the family.
Yeah, she was horrified. Egyptians don't join the police force, she kept saying. My brother and many cousins, and most of our relatives, in fact, have done very well, either doctors or lawyers or whatever. But there's a famous joke that Rami Malek, who played Freddie Mercury in the movie about Queen, who's Egyptian. He rang his mother after he won the Best Actor Oscar Award. Said to Mum, I've won the Best Actor Oscar Award. And she goes, that's nice, son, but you're not a doctor.
Were there a lot of people who looked like you when you joined the New South Wales Police Force?
I think my memory is that I was the only one of a migrant stock, and a lot of them I think were taller than me as well. But I was probably had been a handful before I came along, I'm sure. But there certainly was not a proliferation of migrants in the New South Wales Police in the early 80s.
Your first posting was to the inner city, Sydney suburb of Balmain, and this is the 80s, isn't it? And so this is pre-Balmain gentrification, because it's,
That's
quite a
true.
wealthy suburb these days.
It is, yeah. No, I don't think it was. I mean, there's still a strong presence there of the painters and dockers, both living there but also drinking in the pubs and hanging out in the area.
This is a union that sort of turned into a criminal syndicate.
It was very much a criminal organisation, and we certainly in the police we were warned that certain pubs you don't go to unless you want to have a fight, because they're there and they'll pick you for being a cop and it'll be on.
What kind of street crime was going on there that you were trying to combat as a beat officer?
Yeah, firstly in uniform and then as a junior detective. It's what they call volume crime, which is break and enters, assaults, stealing of some sort, maybe attempts at credit card fraud that weren't very sophisticated. And there's always, regrettably in our society, there's always cases of sex abuse and pedophilia. We did come across some of that as well.
So you've grown up in a family where there's a lot of love and an expectation of kindness. Does it rock your world a bit when you go to situations where people are cruel and vicious?
It did a little bit. I mean, I guess I have been blessed, and the bottom line is I knew what I signed up for. I didn't regret it at all and say, gee, this is harder than I thought, maybe I've made a mistake. I never really had that sense.
How do you hang on to yourself and not slide into cynicism or pessimism even?
I think I'm reasonably confident in myself. I had values that I was taught and drilled into me when I was young, and I've tried to live by those and adhere to them throughout. And if you do that, you have a core sort of resilience, if you like, of you know who you are, you know what you stand for, no matter what happens around you, you're not going to just change and do something bad just to fit in. And I found that quite sort of comforting.
Were there days as a beat cop which were truly satisfying? I mean, it's really easy to talk about the things that go wrong, but were there days when you went home and you went, man, I did a good bit of work today?
I think probably some of the domestic violence stuff where we stopped someone from really hurting a woman or a kid. They were good. I mean, the laws back then were far more lax. Now they have very stringent laws with refusing bail and so on. But we worked with what we had, and so I can think of a few occasions where I felt at the end of the day that was a good day's work.
When you applied to become a detective, a few years in, you were a man with mastery of Arabic. You had some French on you as well. That must have been a huge asset for you in the interview. How did the interview go, the detective, Nick?
I walked in, I think it's called the Bull Ring, where three inspectors, hardened detective inspectors, grill you. And I'm not sure if he's still with us, but a legendary detective inspector, Bill Bendon, I won't use the language he used, but he said, are you the P who speaks 100 languages or words to that effect? Sit down. And I sat down, and he's a huge man. He's probably 6'3" or 4". But it was a fine interview, but it was just a sort of his way of greeting you when you came in. It sort of whacked you in the head.
The New South Wales Police Force in the 80s had a coterie of corrupt detectives, which were coalesced around Detective Sergeant Roger Rogerson in those days. And that had been a situation in the New South Wales Police Force since the 1920s, and there'd been kind of a handover from police detectives. But by the 80s, Roger Rogerson had a lot of influence and control of the heroin trade in Sydney. What was your understanding of that group of officers, and did you come near them? Did you try and stay away from them? How did you get on with them?
I didn't particularly rub shoulders with any of them. Rogerson used to come and have a beer sometimes with some of the detectives that were in our office, just locally somewhere. But I wasn't in the crime squads then. I was just a local detective. But Rogerson was, really seen as a hero. at that stage. He'd done some amazing work. He'd really caught some very bad crooks.
He's one of the most decorated officers, or maybe the most decorated officer on the force.
Yeah, I think he's been eclipsed. But the bottom line is he had this legendary reputation for being fearless and doing the right thing.
Was he a charismatic figure?
He was very much a charismatic figure. When he walked into a pub, there was a lot of adulation. He had done some amazing work, but we now know, obviously, he did a whole lot of bad things as well. The thing that was unforgivable for me, among the many things that he did, the truly bad thing, was that he appears to have played a part in the attempted murder of Mick Drury, who's a very good friend of mine, obviously, and he'd been through hell, because at the time, many people actually took Rogerson's side. Even though someone had tried to kill Mick and they'd shot him and he nearly died while he was standing at the kitchen sink at home holding his daughter, people just refused to believe that Roger had any involvement in it.
Was there an understanding in the force at the time of you keep away from such people, or was it known amongst the fellow officers?
I'm not sure that the average suburban detective, Rogerson may not have even registered with people, but there certainly were people, and people I knew, who said something's not right with this mob, and the answer is to stay away. Just stay away from them, don't get involved with them.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. You can find more conversations on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Now, you made the decision to go into work as an undercover police officer. Did you want that job, or were you tapped for it, Nick?
I was tapped initially, and then I realised I had a bit of an aptitude for it, so I kept going. But I wasn't actually a full-time person. I was someone who was being a detective during the day and just going in to do different operations once in a while.
Doing them interstate or in the same city?
Sydney, but Sydney's a big place. And New South Wales, not just Sydney, New South Wales.
Right. When you said you had an aptitude, what do you think you were able to bring to the job?
I think an ability to get people to sort of trust me, to believe what I'm saying.
So tell me about your first job, major job, as an undercover cop, getting close to one of Sydney's biggest drug dealers, a man called Boutros Fargo.
So there's a fellow called Boutros Fargo, and there had been many reports about his activities, and he was basically a one-man drug supermarket, but there was also a feeling among law enforcement that he'd be too difficult to tackle with surveillance.
Why with surveillance? What was
he would conduct counter-surveillance. He would make sure he wasn't being followed if he went anywhere to do anything. He would change cars. He would take very difficult routes where he would know if anyone's behind him was following him. Just classical drug dealer counter-surveillance.
So he was good at avoiding surveillance, and there was the thinking that undercover police work wouldn't work for him, but then I suppose you were the element that changed that equation. In this undercover role, what was your cover identity in approaching this?
I didn't have a very well-developed one because I wasn't supposed to play a major role. I was there as a bit of a prop. The informant, who was also of Arabic extraction, was supposed to introduce me. We could talk Arabic, and he'd say that I was the purchaser or the buyer with the money. I may have looked the part with a nice car and so on. But as it turned out, the target lost interest in the informant and said, why would I talk to the horse's backside when I can talk to the horse's head? So he initiated direct contact, and he basically said, I just want to deal with you. I don't want this guy in the middle.
So how did this relationship with this man develop between you and him over time?
We had quite a few dinners. I think I ate at his house, and we had met in the city in various places, and we formed a bond.
And you posing as like a Mr. Big, is that the idea? You're going to buy a large part of his product?
Yeah. That's basically it. But when we say Mr. Big, I mean, I don't think it was in those terms. It was simply someone who was of Arabic extraction, who was dabbling in drugs, was happy to buy as much as this fellow was willing to sell. I didn't say I was part of a criminal organisation or anything like that.
Did you wear your own clothes, or do you have to go and buy different clothes? How does that work?
I did stock up on a couple of nice suits. I just took the approach that I wasn't going to be in jeans, torn jeans with earrings or long hair. I used to wear nice suits and I would use nice cars.
Is that mirroring too? Like you're looking a bit like him. He's a well-dressed guy. You both speak Arabic.
Yeah.
You're connecting at that level.
Yeah.
Did he start to open up to you in a more personal way over time?
He did, and it's not problematic, but some of the people that we've seen arrested from undercover operations at the end actually refuse to believe for some time that the person they know is in fact a police officer. And that happened to me a couple of times where I had to go in and tell them I'm actually a police officer after they've been arrested because they just refuse to believe it. Otherwise, they think the investigating police or the interviewing police are lying.
There's that old saying, if you buy a fake painting for a lot of money, you're going to be the last person to be persuaded that it's a fake painting because you've got so much invested in it. That's what it is. Yeah. So what happened on the day you were all set to buy a huge ton of hash oil from this man?
I walked out. It was in his house. I walked out. And
with what? Did you have the actual items?
Yeah.
And what were the items in?
Jars and boxes that had the jars in them.
So you got all these jars and boxes of hash oil?
Yes.
And you walked out of his house?
Yes.
And then what happened?
I let a particular signal go, and they swooped in and arrested him on the spot, and then executed a search warrant in the house and found more stuff. And he had agreed to supply more drugs, which under legislation in New South Wales, agreeing to supply actually carries the same penalty as actual supply.
He thought he'd found a mate. How upset was he to find out that you were not what he seemed to be?
I may have disappointed him.
So was there a moment when you came to him and said, I'm not what I seem to be, or did other officers tell him that?
No, other officers told him that, and I think he accepted it. He wasn't one of the ones who, was in denial.
Was he a dangerous man?
I think he had the capability, but I didn't see that. I only saw, a relatively sort of friendly side of him. You would say he was almost buttering me up the whole time because he thought I could be his meal ticket.
Maybe this is a bad word to use, but is there something, like I'm laughing at, is there something that's enormously good fun about that kind of an undercover operation, or is it just fearfulness and tension the whole time and worry?
It's a bit of both, actually, but there is a sense of, not happiness or joy, but a sense of fulfillment or achievement, if you like, on getting home. I mean, he had agreed to supply heroin and other drugs as we went along. So you feel a sense of achievement, if you like, in having prevented large amounts of drugs entering the market and hurting people. My view is that soft drugs can often lead to harder drugs. So getting everything off the street that's illegal is in my view, a good thing.
Is such a case addictive in its own right? Is that like a kind of an addictive substance for you? Because it must be quite hard to return to the low adrenaline, normal form of life after completing such a satisfying operation.
No, I didn't really feel that. I guess there were wiser heads around me who handled me in a way, many much more senior officers around me who had worked in the drug field for some time, and they guided me to some extent along the way.
What did they tell you at the end of an operation?
You've got to know who you are. I mean, you can't lose sight of the fact you're not, and I know in other places like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, when you eventually go to court to give evidence, or testify as they call it, they make you wear the red serge, the full uniform, and you give evidence under your real name. It's just so everybody knows who's who. So it was made clear to me, and it was clear to me, that I am a police officer. I'm not this person's friend. I'm there to get a job done. I'm there to get drugs off the street, and I will go back to being a police officer. And then, I'm sure there have been over the years people who did get entrapped by the lifestyle, the glamour, the money, the excitement of it all. I was fairly comfortable that wasn't going to happen to me, and it didn't happen.
What about being trapped in the other self, though? That's the more serious danger, I would think. You live this life, you speak as this person, the lines start to come naturally to you, then you have those kind of emotional bonds you form. You create this other persona in your head, and where does that persona go once you've walked away from it?
I made a point of shedding it pretty much as soon as the shift was over, but there is an element of, some of the criminals that I've seen, not just in undercover work, but in drug work generally, you almost have a bit of empathy for them because they're someone, if they weren't selling drugs, you would probably get on with them and you'd probably enjoy having a beer with them or whatever. But you have to keep it in check. You have to keep it in context. You're there to get the job done, and you do.
You were put on the hunt for the postcard robber, Christopher Dean Badness Bintz. He spelled badness with a double S with a $sign through it, a notorious armed robber and one of the most brilliant prison escapees in Australian history as well. Tell me about the hunt for Christopher Dean Badness Bince, who I believe is still languishing in the Victorian jail as we speak.
I think he is, but I'm not certain. I've lost track of him. But we had very good relationships and cooperation with the Victorian Armed Hold-Up Squad. And as I moved from armed robberies to homicide, a lot of the guys from the Armed Robbery Squad had also moved to homicide. So we continued to collaborate and cooperate and so on. But Christopher Bince was just a problem child everywhere he went. And there's a fairly legendary detective in Victoria Police, both in the Armed Hold-Up Squad and later in homicide, who he took a dislike to, and he used to send him postcards from wherever he was, after he escaped. That fella, Ken Ashworth, and I did check with him that if it's okay if I can use his name. Really, really solid detective who'd done a lot of good work over many decades. But this guy just used to drive him nuts, sending him these postcards, and then every time they'd arrest him, put him in jail, he'd escape. So he went to, as we said at the beginning, to have hair transplants at a particular place. And we found out from a phone that we suspected he was using that he was ringing this hair transplant place. So we went there and we asked if they had a Christopher Bince on the books. No one by that name. So we showed them a photo and they said, "Oh, Mr. Smith, yeah, he comes all the time. He'll be here on Wednesday in Melbourne," or whatever it was. So we knew he had to travel anyway. We conveyed the information and he was arrested at Melbourne Airport by the Armed Hold-Up Squad down there. And
Mr. Smith, really?
Mr. Smith.
Couldn't he have tried a little harder than that? So he was pinged and he was sent to jail?
Yeah, he had committed offences in New South Wales. He committed offences everywhere he went. So he was wanted at various points in time in different states and had to serve time in various jurisdictions. The last I'd heard, he was in Melbourne in custody.
On one occasion, you went undercover to pose as a hitman. What can you tell me about this case?
It was actually probably not as dramatic as it might sound. There was a low-level sort of crook in the north coast of New South Wales who had attempted or molested someone, and he'd been arrested and charged. He wanted to make sure that the victim didn't turn up at court to make the complaint against him. So he had sought from someone, "Do you know any crooks that can come and knock this guy off?" And that person that he went to informed the police, and then the investigator at the time, who was a good friend of mine up the north coast, and he said, "Can you come up? Appreciate if you can just do this short, sharp job," as he put it, which it was. I think we had 2 meetings. That was it. He told me what he wanted. He paid a deposit and identified the person that was to be killed.
Right. Now, you're a pretty affable guy, and that really worked for you in that other undercover role I was speaking of, being affable, keeping yourself to yourself and all that sort of thing. Do you have to be a different kind of person if you're posing as a hitman, Nick?
Yeah, you've got to identify the target audience, and you've got to aim yourself, pitch it at that level. For this guy, I wasn't all that affable. I said very little. I was a big, hard, tough guy with underworld connections who had done this before and was capable of doing it again. It's a different persona.
How did that play out? He engaged you, and what were you trying to look to get from him? Some kind of recorded conversation as evidence?
It was basically all our conversations were recorded, and he was very open about what he wanted done.
And how did he want it done? Did he have any idea?
He said he didn't care. He just wanted it done. He said you can run him off the road at a particular area, down the cliff. You can do whatever you want. But he did say at a couple of points in time that he wanted him to be hurt, to suffer. He really obviously hated this fellow, but after he indicated what he wanted done and it was all recorded, he was arrested and charged and convicted for all of that.
I wonder, again, there's that moment when they realise that they're the victim of an undercover sting like that. I wonder how it was for this extraordinarily cruel person to be stung like that.
I don't know, but I guess, Richard, most people who have done this sort of work would think, we hope it's a deterrent for other crooks to read about, to know about, and to say, gee, and before I do this thing, it's a possibility that whoever I'm dealing with is not who they say they are. So maybe I shouldn't do this. I don't know. I mean, I'm being a bit romantic here. But,
no, I think that's a pretty sound tactic, isn't it? Is to try and destroy trust within the criminal fraternity, isn't it?
Yes.
In the late 90s, Nick, you were the subject of a surveillance operation by your own police force. How did you find out that your office and home were being bugged by the New South Wales Police Force?
It took some years before we found out the extent of what was happening, but I had upset a number of the senior people in Internal Affairs and the Police Integrity Commission. At that stage, Internal Affairs was called Special Crime and Internal Affairs, and the Special Crime element is the group that targeted me. And they had a licence without good reason, to investigate anything, not just police corruption, but anything they wanted to, which has never made sense, and then obviously later they were disbanded. And the co-leader of that group was a fellow called Mark Standen, who later on was arrested for one of Australia's biggest conspiracy to import methamphetamines into Australia. But I had upset them wearing my hat as a union official and then later as a member of the executive of the union, criticising what was going on in terms of unfairness, if you like, in how people were being treated. We had the Woodrow Commission, and there's no doubt we had many problems. We fixed up our problems and we've moved forward from there. But there were people who felt that they can still do whatever they want to do. And I don't think there's any denial, and I think James Wood himself would admit, there was no procedural fairness. We had double-digit suicides during the Royal Commission of people who were targeted, sometimes unfairly, sometimes fairly. And there were many who thought they could continue doing that sort of thing and be unaccountable. And that's what we complained about.
Yes, it wasn't just you, was it? How many
No, there was 114 of us on this warrant. The warrant came to light because it was served in evidence in a completely unrelated matter. If I can just explain, everybody who wants to bug someone, a police officer or any agency that wants to bug someone, has to have an officer swear an affidavit on oath containing all the justification, if you like, for bugging someone, invading their privacy, exhausted traditional means. This is the only way we're going to get them. We're only going to invade there, and it's a very serious offence that falls into certain categories, and therefore you must allow us to bug them. And then a Supreme Court judge, would read the affidavit and then sign the actual warrant. The warrant is what's served on people, given to people when they go to court after they've been arrested and charged. The affidavit usually remains a secret. So for us, there was a warrant served in a case, in a brief, that none of us were involved in, and then we realised pretty much every notable detective in New South Wales was on that warrant. 114 of us, including one or two journalists. I think there were one or two lawyers as well. So it was astounding that you could satisfy a judge with enough information that you had to bug 114 people. You'd need a lever arch folder for each of us.
It's reported that the chief informant in this surveillance unit was a corrupt former undercover officer, codenamed M5, who tried and failed several times to entrap you in conversation with a listening device. What do you make of that, Nick?
It was an amateur attempt, a really amateur attempt. I mean, I had not only been an undercover operative, I had won a scholarship and studied this stuff in North America. I had come back and revamped that space. I rewrote the training program. I knew more about that stuff. I literally wrote the book about this stuff. To send someone who was untrained and didn't know what he was doing, it took me 5 minutes to work out this isn't what he said it is. He came in under some pretext to talk to me about an old case. One thing detectives don't do is go to see someone that they've never worked with. I've never worked with him, never been in the same squad as him, never did a case with him, never had anything to do with him, and he comes in and starts telling me about all the things he's done in his younger days. Detectives don't do that. Even if you have done something wrong, you're not just going to go in and bare your soul. So I eventually told him to go away, just leave me alone.
Did you suspect something was up at that point?
I think I worked out pretty much exactly what was happening. I'd upset internal affairs, and they were using him to try and get to me. Later on, we received all the affidavits behind the warrants, and subsequently I found out, if I can cut it short, that I was the subject of 81 bugging warrants over 3.5 years. 81. Neddy Smith or any major criminal in New South Wales couldn't possibly compete with that.
You were fully exonerated in the inquiry, but how many years did it take for you to clear up your name?
I think it's probably the best part of a decade. There has never actually been a substantive allegation put to me. The tragedy of this is that when we got the affidavits eventually, most of us just got them in the mail anonymously, but the main affidavit for the main warrant with 114 names, which you must roll over or renew every 3 weeks in New South Wales, so a Supreme Court judge has to look at it again every 3 weeks. This went on for 3 years at least. In the main affidavit, I and about 50 or 60 others are not mentioned. There is no information against me in the affidavit, and yet judges, 21 Supreme Court judges in New South Wales, for the best part of 3 years, were signing the warrant again and again and again without reading anything. I think there's been a failure in the system, and I've said this, and there's a failure in leadership in that both the judiciary and the political class, and certainly leaders in New South Wales Police, eventually had worked out what happened, but there were no consequences for anyone in the end.
Meanwhile, in 2004, you applied to join a force of law enforcement officers to help rebuild Iraq's police force. This is post-invasion, after the ouster of Saddam Hussein. I don't think I can imagine a more difficult job in the whole world than to try and rebuild the Iraqi Police Force, and maybe that's just the benefit of hindsight. Why did you want the job?
It's a really nice segue, actually, Richard, from what we were just talking about. I think I just wanted to get away from everyone and everything, and I had lost faith in basically in the leadership of the police at that stage. I thought I'd go somewhere with a bit less conflict and hostility. Iraq compared to the police hierarchy.
Just for the peace and quiet. I'm going to Baghdad, right?
So Saddam fell in 2003 and the coalition of the willing wanted to rebuild the police, obviously. I had friends in the FBI and then later in the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US that wanted to pull together a team that, in the hundreds to rebuild the Iraqi police, and I was selected. I accepted, I was seconded or loaned to the federal government, the national government here, and I deployed with a number of other advisors. I was the only one in police. The others were agriculture, economics, foreign affairs.
What were the local police officers you were working with like?
I was struck by how similar we all are, even though it's a completely different culture. There were many times I'd be in the meal room in a police station having pizza late at night, and the banter and the jokes and the sense of humour, it is very similar. Police tend to adopt black humour to survive a lot of the things they go through. But there's some really talented people there. And I'm not political, but I didn't go because I agreed with George Bush or anything else. I went because the way it was set out for me was that the Iraqis need help. We've got rid of their government. We've got rid of a dictatorship. They actually need someone to help them rebuild now. And I went for that reason. I am an Arab. I spoke the language. I was familiar with the region, and I thought I could help. And there weren't that many Arabic speakers in the coalition forces at the time.
How about the US mission that was there at the time? There's really no other way of describing it as like extraordinarily boneheaded. They seem to be new to the idea that there was strife between Sunnis and Shias. They didn't seem to understand that Arabic politics, particularly in Iraq and outside of Baghdad, is going to be largely dealing with tribal chieftains. They expected to find, or maybe they didn't expect to find, weapons of mass destruction. The whole thing was such a debacle and driven by incuriosity, overconfidence, arrogance, ignorance, all those sorts of things. And you've got to try and help patch together something like a police force. In all honesty, was that what the kind of thing you were dealing with, or have I been way too harsh here with this?
No, I think you're probably on the money. The thing is, I think there were tensions within the US administration. This is all a matter of public record, but the State Department was led by Richard Armitage and Colin Powell, and they had both military men who had served distinguished careers.
Who had warned
and
Bush
they were
and
against
Cheney
a lot of what was happening
and
there.
Rumsfeld, what would happen, and they were not listened to.
No,
yes.
but that more importantly, they had actually had a plan for what ought to happen after the invasion, and that was completely overruled and put aside by the defence establishment, which was, as you said, Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld. And they were almost at war on the ground in Iraq with many arguments between the two sort of camps in the different directions. I think the biggest mistake the US made in Iraq, and I joke with my kids, say, if I ever invade a country, I'm going to do it differently. But I think what they should have done is left as much of the former regime as possible in place. The decision to the de-Baathification process, if you like, getting rid of anyone who was in the Baath party under Saddam, which is pretty much anyone, was the biggest mistake. So they sacked the entire military, hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened men who had no job, no future, no prospects. And then we raced towards the capital, the coalition that is, and overran many compounds, military compounds, really just putting padlocks on chains and leaving them there because we had to get to the capital. And then many weeks later when we came back, the stuff was gone. So you had a very fertile ground in people who had no future, no prospects, no money, and had been sacked and tainted by being aligned with the former regime, and they had access to weaponry and materiel. What did we think was going to happen? And then, a really complex layer on top of that is all the sectarian conflicts, the Sunnis, the Shiites, and then the Kurds up north. Obviously, whoever had planned this had not studied adequately the history of Iraq and how they all came to be squashed into one box and how they've been grading against each other for decades.
Police forces don't exist on their own. They're part of an ecosystem. And to have a good police force, you also need to have good courts and a good government at the same time, to make the laws, to rule on them and then to enforce them. I mean, can you exist outside in a system where there's a government that's dealing with serious corruption and feuding? And you're asking too much of a decent police force without those other factors.
No, I think you're right, but I would take it further. I think you can't have commerce or a proper economy running without those things and the rule of law. I mean, people would not invest in Iraq if they thought, if something goes wrong, we're never going to get a fair shake here. We can't go to court. And I think that's one of the things that holds back a lot of people from going to or investing in different parts of the Middle East because they don't think they're going to get a fair go. We actually, very consciously did our best, not only to try and establish good, fair, modern processes, which Saddam simply didn't have, but also to try and convince the public, the people of Iraq, that things have changed and we're moving forward and they should have some confidence in where we're heading. That sectarian issue between the different groups, particularly the Sunni and the Shiites, is something that, there was a lot of bloodletting after Saddam left. Saddam was a Sunni, which is a minority in the country. The Shiites and the Kurds had been oppressed very badly, and many Sunnis were as well. And it was, in many people's eyes, it was a chance to get even.
You were brought in as well in 2009 by the United Nations to help be part of an investigation into the assassination of the Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. He was assassinated in a plot where Hezbollah was almost certainly involved, and possibly Syria as well. And you delivered a report to the UN on that work. These are all difficult, dangerous jobs you've undertaken in the Middle East. Nonetheless, was there something about being back in the Arabic world for you that was satisfying? Is that the word I'm looking for here? How do you feel about being back in, even in some of these worst-case scenario situations, to be back in the Arabic world again, speaking that language and having all those cultural affinities again? Was that something in that for you?
I think there was. And there is a thing which I was very conscious of. They call it being a mission junkie, where you get addicted to the mission, the danger, the adrenaline and all of that. I wasn't susceptible to that because I was aware of it. But it was a satisfying experience. I feel very comfortable. I speak the language, I know the region, and they keep asking me back for some reason, which I guess means I haven't stuffed it up. So I'm happy about that. But I do feel some kinship there when I go. I quite enjoy it. The food, the weather, the people. The people are very warm, as you all know, very hospitable. I mean, I don't know how many times you'd be driving anywhere in Lebanon where you just ask for directions and they insist on giving you food or asking you into their house. I mean, who does that in Sydney?
So you retired in 2016. It sounds, just from talking to you, it seems that the foundation of your work, or your foundation of your ability to function very successfully as a police officer, is based in your upbringing. That very, very solid family upbringing you had. Your mum, like I said, was furious you didn't become a doctor. Did she ever come around to the fact that you'd been a successful police officer? Did she end up proud of you in the end?
I think she did. And she used to tell me that sometimes if she caught a cab and paid with a card or whatever, let's say they'd ask about the surname, whether she was related to me. And she'd tell me once she thought there'd be an Arabic person driving the cab or whatever, and she'd take great pride in telling them that I was her son.
It's been really great speaking with you, Nick, and so enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Nick Kaldas' memoir is called Behind the Badge. This program was made on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer is Nicola Harrison. The executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Got complicated feelings about pop culture? Stop Everything is a podcast that helps you work it out.
I'm not coming in here being like, guys, 90 minutes or nothing. Titanic, 3 hours and 14 minutes. It has to sink. It has to sink slowly to feel that impact of the sinking.
I'm glad you said it's like not 90 minutes or bust, Hannah, because I think like it should take the form that it needs to have, right? And like a movie like The Brutalist, 3.5 hours with the interval, we don't have that muscle anymore where it's like, this is my dedicated time and I'm going to enjoy it and I'm going to appreciate it. And I frankly felt like the story was, there is brutality in the story, but I was like, the experience of just taking myself to the cinema, sitting down in a seat, I didn't mind it.
Book talk trends, problematic celebrities, or reality TV. Whatever it is, join me, Hannah Reish.
And me, Beverly Wang, as we unapologetically overthink pop culture.
Find Stop Everything on the ABC Listen app.